So then that'll be live as well.
Great.
Cool. We will be up shortly. It's still loading on my screen, even though it says that we are live right now, which is great.
Great. So we're just going to give about 30 seconds here. Hopefully get some people coming in as we get ready to do Beyond the Adventure.
Sounds great. All right, so we are up right now on YouTube.
All right, sounds good.
Sweet.
Well, let's go ahead and get started with some introductions. So I am Jeff Schroeder, and if any of you have watched Discovery Adventures, you probably remember me from some of those. And we're doing our little series here, Beyond the Adventure, where we're gonna follow up on a few of our favorite episodes and talk about kind of the process and answer extra questions and things like that from the episodes. And I'm joined.
Hey everyone, my name is Lauren Wagner. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Learning Operations Coordinator in the Learning Center, and I'll be helping Jeff facilitate the talk today and ask him some questions that you may have pre-submitted or questions you have along the way.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Today, we are going to revisit our episode called Megafauna, or Were Armadillos and Sloths Once Giant? And this was one of our popular episodes. This dealt with ancient creatures that were not dinosaurs, but were very, very big, just the same. And some of those would have been like giant ground sloths and giant armadillo relatives called glyptodons. We also talked about mammoths and mastodons. We talked about saber-toothed cats. And we talked a little bit about how these animals got big and why they're not around anymore. So if you have questions about any of those things, feel free to ask. Some of that's in the episode, but I'm happy to talk about it again. Today, we're just going to talk a little bit more about how we decided what to do for the episode, decided what to include. I'm going to hit a couple of really cool items here that we'll talk about in a moment. And of course, take any questions that you have from the audience if you're watching live, or if we had pre-submitted questions, we'll hit those as well. So yeah, megafauna, again, mega means huge, fauna is animals, so they are big animals, and oftentimes it's used to refer to mammals that lived after the dinosaurs. So giant mammals, like some of those I mentioned already, like the giant ground sloths, mammoths, mastodons, giant armadillo-like relatives. And there are still, of course, megafauna around today if you just consider it very, very large animals. We'll talk about that too. All right. So, Lauren, do we have any pre-submitted questions or any questions just about like megafauna in general and what that means or what it might include?
Absolutely, Jeff. So you mentioned earlier that we had some megafauna examples like the giant ground sloth, like a regular sloth relative, and glyptodons like armadillos. So are mammoths and mastodons considered megafauna, even though elephants, modern day elephants, are the same size?
Yeah, so they would be. Megafauna just means like, that's a great question. Megafauna just means it's like a very large animal, right? So it could have a smaller counterpart, or it might not even have a smaller counterpart, but it's big and it's an animal. So you could consider a lot of dinosaurs megafauna as well. I usually use it to refer to the mammals. So some of these megafauna do have smaller relatives today, right? Like a smaller sloth or an armadillo. Others may not have a smaller relative today, maybe a distant relative in the elephant's case, but they may be large nowadays as well. So it goes different ways. And some of that is like what survives and what doesn't. Yeah.
Is there any, what classifies an animal to be considered a megafauna? Is there like a size requirement that needs to be hit?
You know, that's a great question. And I actually don't have a concrete answer for that. I don't know if there's a certain, I mean, I think if you ask different people, they might give you different answers. If you consider it like a percentage, well, the vast percentage of living things on this planet and animals are small, right? Like invertebrates, insects. So we would be considered megafauna if you were just taking it maybe top 10% or something like that. But usually for humans, we consider it as an animal quite a bit larger than ourselves would be megafauna. Yeah.
Evolving Planet is one of my favorite exhibits at the Field Museum. And I know specifically going through starting at like the Carboniferous with the giant insects, that they're much larger than what we see like a modern day dragonfly looking like. Can you explain why there were so much more megafauna animals back millions of years ago than we have today on Earth?
Yeah, well, there's a couple ways we can think about that. And one is like availability of food sources. There's oftentimes people talk about like the amount of oxygen in the air, but we don't really have like a solid evidence for that. It's more there's a lot of food available, and oftentimes a lot of plants. The earth might have been warmer, maybe more vegetation spread out, and animals could get bigger. A lot of the huge animals are plant eaters, and they get big. They sometimes their stomachs get big so they can digest more, right, with that stomach size. But they get big to reach the plants, like a tall neck or head. And they also just get big to basically as defense, right? So that the meat eater, well, if you get big enough like a lion versus an elephant, single lion's not going to tackle an elephant, right? It doesn't want to mess with that. So size can be a deterrent for a hunter or a defense for the plant eater as well. It's rarer for meat eaters to get really huge. That's why like Sue the T-Rex is so incredible. Another thing though, so that size as a deterrent can actually work the reverse. We talked about this on our episode. I thought this was one of the more interesting discussions we had in the episode we did, Lauren, is sometimes if you're big and meaty and there's a predator that's intelligent enough to use tools and reason and to figure out how to kill you without putting itself in danger, that can work to your detriment. So giant ground sloths, glyptodons, mammoths, mammoths sort of, mastodons, all died out around 10,000 years ago. And we talked about this on the episode. And can you think maybe about what do you think, Lauren, happened about 10,000 years ago in North and South America?
I'm not sure, Jeff. You want to help me out here and help out our audience?
A new species arrived about 5,000 years before that in North and South America. And it was, well, you're looking at them right here. So it's that intelligent species that could use tools, could hunt as groups, could figure out how to tackle these big animals. So if you've got a lot of meat on you, oftentimes those big species we think were selected by early humans coming to a new place and were killed first. So sometimes the big ones died off because of some hunting. It could have been other reasons as well, like climate. So yeah, when we did our episode, we tried to choose a lot of animals we thought would be interesting. Try to highlight usually some, and this is kind of our thought process here, like behind the adventure, what we do is we pick some that are going to highlight, right, what we're talking about, things that people would be super interested in, like a mammoth or mastodon or ground sloth, but then try to hit a few that people might not know as much about or that might be a surprise, like the glyptodon or the giant armadillo relative. Paleontologists would know that, but a lot of people don't think of those. So we try to get a good variety in there. Yeah. So Lauren, any questions or any thoughts about like how we do the episode or why we chose different things or even just about like what we do at the museum?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what made you choose those specific animals to highlight for this episode?
Yeah, good question. So it was actually kind of a mix. I chose mammoths and mastodons because they're kind of like they're pretty charismatic. A lot of people know about them, but it's also fun, and we will in a moment, talking about the difference, because that's something not a lot of people realize. I chose sloths and glyptodons because they have modern day counterparts, right? Or relatives that people see, like an armadillo or a sloth and the tree sloth. And that's why we did the name of the episode, right? That these animals we're used to seeing, these little creatures climbing around or crawling around, used to have these giant counterparts, and it's just so fascinating, right, to think of how big these things used to be and how different they were than they are today. And then I did pick one that was just a personal favorite that we don't even have at the museum, but I had to include it. My absolute favorite, and some of you may remember if you watched the episode, we did a poll on this, but it is the giant rhino relative, the biggest land mammal ever, named Paraceratherium. Fun name to say. But it is a 20-foot tall, basically a rhino without horns, and it is enormous. Biggest beast ever to, mammal ever to walk on the earth. Cool. Well, Lauren, I'm going to go next, and I'm going to show off a couple of cool items here. And we're going to talk a little bit about these. And then if we have any pre-submitted questions or anything with these, we will go ahead and do that as well and talk about these two items. So these are casts. And casts are an exact replica of a fossil or something else, or in this case, a fossil. And this one right here is true to life, real sized. I'm going to show it next to my head like I love to do with Sue's teeth. Now, just for fun, this is a Sue tooth. We always do this, right? Compared to my head. This one is a single tooth from another animal. And let's see if I can cover up my whole head with it. Pretty much. This is an enormous tooth. Now, what in the world could this be from? Any ideas? Everyone think, if you're watching this at home, think about what this could be. One enormous tooth. There's an animal that has enormous teeth like this today. This is a replica tooth from a mammoth. So this would be a mammoth tooth. And I want everyone to look really carefully at the top of the tooth. This is the chewing surface, like the tops of our teeth that we chew with. And if you look at it from the side, it's extremely flat, right? You look at this, there are some little ridges, maybe for grinding. You can hear that. It's kind of rough on the top. Now, here's another one I used in the episode, and I love to compare these. That's why I included both of these. Another tooth. And look at the side. Look how bumpy that is, right? Totally different. It's big, but it's not quite as big. And then it's got these big roots at the bottom. And if you look at the top, wow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 8 or 9 different big like lumps for chewing, kind of like our molars, but a lot rougher. So if you saw these two teeth, well, they're both big, but that's about where the similarities end, right? They look totally different, but they came from animals that look extremely similar. So this big one is a mammoth tooth, as I said, and this is a mastodon tooth. And those are those creatures, they're elephant relatives. They look a lot like mammoths, but they are a little bit not quite as tall in the shoulder. Their tusks are slightly different, but otherwise, a lot of people would mistake one for the other. Their teeth are totally different though. And so it's kind of fun to highlight some of those differences. Lauren, let's see, are there any questions about mammoth or mastodon teeth that we could cover?
Absolutely. So our question here is, since you showed the examples on our screen here of the mammoth and mastodon teeth, why are they shaped so differently? Is because they had different niches in the ecosystem of what plants they ate, or is there another reason, Jeff?
Yeah, great question. So absolutely, it is, and that is correct. It's because they had different diets. And so these two animals were very similar, both huge. How could they all live together without eating each other out of existence? Well, they ate different things, yes. So the mammoth, if we look at this tooth, had that grinding surface. So the mammoths were more grazers. If you think about grazers today, like cows, eating grasses and things from the ground, kind of grazing on it and then grinding it up. Whereas mastodons were a lot more browsers. If you think of like a white-tailed deer today, deer teeth are not flat. If you touch deer teeth, they're kind of rugged and jagged a little bit. They're sharp because deer strip branches and leaves off of trees and grind them up. And so this mastodon tooth is evidence that these guys were browsers, that they would eat more off the trees, pull branches down and like grind them up. So these two animals could live in the same place and coexist by eating different diets, even though they both needed a lot of food. And animals today do that as well. But this is one of those great examples to look at the fossil evidence of an animal that's not alive anymore and make a good conclusion, form a hypothesis and test that and find out about their diets. Cool. Any other questions, Lauren?
So just to clarify, Jeff, mammoths and mastodons, we know they lived at the same time, but do they live in the same exact spot in North America and South America, or are they in different regions of the Americas?
Another great question. Yes, they did live in the same spot. In fact, they both lived around here, as well as other places in the United States. There have been both mammoth and mastodon fossils found around the area around here, around Chicago. So they both would have roamed in where we're living now. Now, there may have, I'm not sure their exact ranges, so there may have been some places where they didn't overlap as much. But there were also other types. So we think of a mammoth, right? And we think of woolly mammoth. We think of that big hairy elephant. But there were other types of mammoths too. There were pygmy mammoths that lived on islands just past California. There were giant like steppe mammoths or Colombian mammoths that would have been almost as big as that rhino relative, bigger than a woolly mammoth, bigger than any elephant today. And then there actually, one of the cool things is there was a population of smaller mammoths that outlived so many of their relatives. Mastodons died, giant ground sloths, about 10,000 years ago. About 4,000 years ago, when the Egyptians were building the pyramids, there were still mammoths around. But they were isolated on a small island or islands between kind of Alaska and Russia around there. And they lived for quite a while, but they were kind of isolated and I think eventually just died out.
I did not know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, mammoths are a little more recent than we thought. Cool.
So with mammoths and mastodons, Jeff, last question here. Which one was bigger? Or were they about the same size?
Yeah, well, so mastodons were a little more specific. They're actually quite a bit different genetically than mammoths. They branched off from that whole family, I think 20,000 years ago, I want to say, whereas mammoths are much more recent. So mastodons were pretty similar, I think, across species in their size. Mammoths were variable. So you actually had some mammoths that were smaller than mastodons, and then you had some that were much, much bigger. But if you think of like the classic woolly mammoth versus mastodon, woolly mammoths were a little bit taller. Their head sloped up a bit more, so they were a little bit taller, probably a little bit heavier than a mastodon. Yeah, good question. So we're going to get ready to wrap up here. We've talked a lot about megafauna, but one thing I do want to hit on before we end is that, well, two things really. One is to think about what are our biggest creatures today? Because we oftentimes think of like dinosaurs have died out and mammoths have died out. Well, dinosaurs are still around as birds, but you know, all the huge things have died out. We have some really big animals today. And of course, we have things like elephants and rhinos, but we have animals today in a different location that are really, really huge. Probably the biggest animal ever in the oceans right now, right? The blue whale. So think about that megafauna we have today that we can still protect and preserve and take care of, especially those whales. And another challenge I have for you, this is fun, this is one of my favorite things, is recently extinct creatures that might surprise you. So just in the past 1,000 years, when people were sailing around and exploring different areas, there were elephant birds in Madagascar that were 12-foot tall, like versions of an ostrich. They were huge and their eggs were about like that big. And there were stellar sea cows. If you know a manatee or a dugong, these were only went extinct, well, around the time the United States became a nation, not that long ago. They were like 30-foot long manatees, you know, bigger than a lot of people's living rooms. So imagine those floating around. And giant Komodo dragon monitor lizards, things like that. Check those out, recently extinct creatures, and they'll surprise you. They're pretty amazing. All right, Lauren, did we have any last questions or thoughts before we get ready to sign off here?
Last question here is, besides the rhino that you mentioned, what is your favorite megafauna or megafauna that's alive today?
Oh gosh, good question. So, and I might even throw that back at you too, just so we can discuss. But yeah, my favorite megafauna. So I am interested. I like big toothed whales. So the blue whale is the biggest. They're neat. They're really cool creatures. But I'm more fascinated by some of the toothed whales, like a sperm whale, which are extremely intelligent, very social, and really, really cool animals. And frankly, you think about the blue whales siphon through little prey, but sperm whales are meat eaters. They eat squid and things. So they technically are one of the biggest, if not the biggest, meat eaters ever. All right. So what about you, Lauren?
So I think my favorite extinct megafauna is the Irish elk, which we have in our Evolving Planet exhibit. There's a beautiful mural made by Charles Knight of the Irish elk, and it just reminds me of something from like Middle Earth or a fantasy sort of world. I just really like them a lot. And then for today, I have to agree with you. I have a very strong love for the whales, but I do have a passion for orca whales. I think they're just so intelligent, and just looking at them and watching them, you know that they're communicating. Yet they're very highly intelligent animals. So
Yeah,
I do love my orca whales.
yeah, they're neat animals. Very cool. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time. So I just wanted to make sure if anyone in the audience had a question or wanted to pop in with one last minute here, please go ahead and send those via the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to just kind of get us ready to wrap up here. So again, hopefully people have had a chance to tune in to see our Discovery Adventures episode on Megafauna, these giant beasts that once roamed the earth, and then have had a chance to learn a little bit more about them, or a little bit more about how we planned out our episodes here. And again, your challenge, well, consider Megafauna from today and think about some of those creatures that have recently been extinct, and then how can we protect those things, especially the whales that Lauren and I love so much. All right. Well, thank you all for viewers. Thanks for great questions. And we are going to sign off. Next week, we'll have another Discovery Adventures Beyond the Adventure coming your way. And next week will be May the 4th. And so to celebrate weird Star Wars type of creatures, we are going to revisit our episode, Weirdest Animals, and may or may not tie those into Star Wars next week. All right.
Great.
Thanks all.
Bye, everyone.